We keep the stories by giving the stories to people who take them and give them again. In the circle of tellers, circle of listeners, who become the tellers of stories that circle the heart like old friends.
Stories found all across Southeast Asia and South Asia, and a friend of mine is from Malaysia, and she'd assured me that that story was told in some form in Malaysia, so I'll put it there, and using it as a bracket. The water carrier's job every morning and every evening was to go down the side of the mountain to the river and to get water, to carry it up to the wealthy household with which he was employed. He carried 2 earthen vessels that were suspended from a pole that went across his shoulders and dangled those vessels at the end. So in the morning he would go down and dip them into the water and carry them back up the side of the mountain. And water was needed in the evening and through the night, and so again at the end of the day he would go down and dip his earthen vessels filled with water, balance them on his shoulders, and make his way up the steep mountain road. This went on day after day, year after year. And as the man aged, he still performed his task as the water carrier. And one day, as he was going down to the river and dipping in his earthen vessels, filling them with water, and started back up the hill, one of the clay pots spoke and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but through the years, as you and I have grown old, I have developed a crack. And as you have noticed that you fill me up each morning and each evening, and as I go up the side of the mountain, I lose so much water that I hardly have enough for the household when we arrive. And I want to apologize. It's time for me to be replaced, for I have cost you so much labor." As I mentioned last night, I had spent a lot of years working with the homeless shelter in Columbia, Missouri, St. Francis House, the Capital Worker Community. And a number of years ago, there was legislation coming up in front of the U.S. Congress that was going to cut money for affordable housing. And we were in communication with groups across the country and said we needed to go to Washington, D.C. and communicate with our elected representatives about our concern about this cut in the budget. So 250,000 of my closest friends went to Washington, D.C. to have a day of information and marching in the mall and speaking with our representatives. Well, a group of us from Columbia decided we had enough to fill a van. So some of us who worked with housing issues and some of the homeless men and others all piled in the van, took the trip to Washington, D.C. to spend the day. Now, the rule was that each of us had to have a buddy, the buddy system for when you were adolescents, to take care of each other. And my buddy for the trip was William. William is one of the most schizophrenic people that I know. William has conversations, with a multitude of people that I don't experience. William has stories about his life on other planets and the many different times that he has died and been resurrected. Now, when William's on medication, he's pretty good. When he's not, he's pretty weird. William disappeared once for about a year, and we assumed that he'd wandered off to some other part of the country and probably wound up in jail. But one day, William reappeared. We have no idea where William had been. We discovered just about a year ago that William had family. We didn't know that, but by an odd set of circumstances, we tracked down family and discovered that William had been in a mental health institution since childhood, but was released as an adult. The family had long assumed that William had died and disappeared. We were able this last year to reconnect William with some of his family. William is in his 60s now. On that trip to Washington, D.C., William and I were buddies. We kept track of each other during the march and during the visitation at the Capitol. And we were that afternoon on the mall in Washington, D.C., listening to speakers and music. And William's a coffee drinker, which may indeed contribute to some of William's experiences. William was kind of dancing around as William often did, and he looked at me and he said, "Want a cup of coffee, man?" I said, "Oh, that'd be great, William. You want to get us some coffee?" And over to the side of the mall there in Washington, D.C. was a string of vendors parceling out goodies, and I just pointed, I said, "William, head right over there, get us some coffee and come back." And William took off, and he got about 10 feet away from me and turned around and came back and says, "Don't get lost, man." I said, "It's okay, William. I'll stay right here, I'll watch, and when you get the coffee and come back, I'll watch and I'll wave and you'll connect." Well, this time he took off and he got about twice as far. And he came back and he says, "Don't get lost, man." I said, "Okay, William, okay." Even though I wanted to stay and hear the speakers, the music, I said, "I'll go with you, we'll get the coffee." We went over and got in line, and there was a couple of hundred people in line. We're standing there, and William's dancing around. He says, "Don't you want a cup of coffee, man?" I said, "We have to wait in line, William. Then we'll get our coffee." "Don't you want a cup of coffee, man?" And all of a sudden, William pulled out of the line, went to the head of the line, bought 2 cups of coffee, and brought them back to me. You see, William lives in another world. The rules are different. We went back, enjoyed our coffee. The trip was pretty much a success, and we came back. Well, as I mentioned last night, about every 5 or 6 weeks I go over to the St. Francis House, do a little music, and sometimes have a bit of a worship service. Ever since that time, about 10 years ago, every time that I'm at St. Francis House, whether I'm in the middle of a song, in the middle of a meditation, doing prayer, distributing elements of communion, it may not have any relationship to what I'm doing, William will bring me a cup of coffee. And whatever I'm doing, in the middle of a prayer, in the middle of a song, playing the guitar, I stop and thank William for that cup of coffee. We're buddies for life. And as the cracked pot was apologizing to the water carrier for all of the extra labor that he had caused the carrier said, "No, don't apologize. Look back up to the side of the road that goes up the mountain, and you'll notice that I always carry you on my right side. And if you'll notice on the left side, the road is rocky and barren, but on the right side where I carried you, look at the beautiful green foliage and flowers blooming. For every trip I made back up the mountain, as you lost some of the water out of the crack, you have nourished the ground. I've planted flower seeds, and through the years I have gathered flowers which have decorated the home of my master. No, don't apologize, for I thank you for your gift, the cracked pot, the cup of coffee."
We keep the stories by giving the stories to people who take them and give them again. In the circle of tellers, the circle of listeners who become the tellers of stories that circle the heart like old friends.